Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Beyond the Headlines, a very special one indeed. My name is Amalina Kamal, returning as your host for this latest round of Information Digest. Now, it's almost at the end of the year, and Malaysia has witnessed a series of triumphs and challenges. The socio-political landscape in particular saw a lot of news developments surrounding political figures and the dynamism they bring to Malaysian politics. But of course, we have to acknowledge the strides that we have achieved so far in education, health, as well as social finance. Now, irrespective of what the year has brought us, we owe it to ourselves to collectively pause, reflect, and engage in introspection. Now, this is 2023 Revisited. Now, joining me on the set, we have Straits Times' very own associate editor, Najmuddin Najib. Hi, Naj.
Hey, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
All right.
I'm glad to have you in this, news wrap-up that we have today. Also, together on the set, we have our business reporter, Asila Jalil, that we'll be talking about, and the top news that broke in business at least.
Hi.
Welcome, Asila.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Also, our special guest, I would like to welcome from Institute of Strategic and International Studies, Malaysia, Senior Fellow, Edin Khoo. Welcome, Edin.
Thank you for having me.
For today's topic, right, as we revisit the Madani nation, at least 1 year on, I would just like to highlight, at the forefront of it all, of course, is our Prime Minister Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim himself championing the cause against corruption. Now, he set the tone, at least for 2023, with his commitment echoing throughout, the corridors of power and prompting us to examine not only the public and political community's response, but also, the tangible actions taken by the government itself in combating corruption. So, if I can bring our audience to, our news report on January 24, specifically, Anwar actually said, to not challenge him as he defended his anti-corruption stance. Now, this comes after, a lot of public criticism, especially on social media, but he emphasized that investigations into corruption is still independently under MACC. Now, Edin, I just want to understand this. In the past year, or in the past months at least, what kind of concrete progress have you seen the government achieve in combating corruption?
Well, I think it's a very difficult task. And you have to also study the Prime Minister's own individual approach to this. And we have to understand him historically, of course. Remember that he was once very much a part of the establishment and then broke away and made corruption, the fight against corruption, essentially his fundamental, a foundational platform. So he has come into power. Very emphatic, I think. That's been reiterated by our incoming Yang di-Pertuan Agong, who's also kind of signaled or identified corruption as one of the major challenges for the nation. Having said of all of that, I mean, there has been a very concerted effort by the MACC, but I think more structural things need to be done to make the MACC more independent, answerable to Parliament rather than come under the government purview. All these things have been discussed for a very, very long time. I think among the public, among the collective, there is broad support, of course, for the fight against corruption. But in particular individual cases, the public tends to get a little confused as to why this and not that. About a year ago, I made a rather radical statement, controversial maybe, because I think corruption has become so incredibly endemic and become part of how business is done, really, that to throw a very broad net would really be quite impossible. And it will not absolve you of seeming favoritism. Some people get it, other people don't. And I advocated a kind of corruption amnesty, actually. But along with the corruption amnesty, then a real retightening and real structural changes to how bodies like the MACC operate.
By corruption amnesty, can you elaborate a bit on what you mean?
I have very little idea about how that actually takes place. Right. It was just the thought that perhaps I think should be considered a lot better. If you look at every kind of area as I say, this exchange of money, is something that was actually identified by Syed Hussein Alatas, the sociologist.
Right.
That after a while, corruption is not seen as corruption; it's just seen as a way of doing business. So apart from these kind of practical efforts at fighting corruption, I think the psychology of it within a society. Syed Hussein actually referred to it as a cancer because people don't identify corruption to be corruption.
I mean, following up to that, to identify corruption as corruption, MACC itself, began the year with, an arrest of a CEO over misappropriation, of more than 92 billion ringgit from the economic stimulus package that we saw being presented in previous administration. And also spill over to that, with multiple investigations that they've been doing, they also went into, investigating major banks involved in international scams. And part of that operation, or at least the operation, is called Ops Tropicana. Just now you mentioned about, we need structural change, but what sort of measures are already in place that we need to ensure the stability or trustworthiness of the independent bodies that are, carrying out corruption investigations? And second question to that would be, how do we ensure trust again in the banking sector?
Yeah, I mean, here again, we are talking about essentially very, very great structural changes that need to be commenced. And whether there is actually enough autonomy, the central bank especially in particular, in imposing certain kind of... I mean, some of our banking regulations really, don't enter my brain as sensible at all. They seem to be, checks for the simple reason of being checks. They don't actually make very much sense. So I think a real reformulation about what our financial industries and sectors really are all about and how they actually facilitate. Why do some people find it so hard to get, the most minimal of loans, and other people can see transfers of, billions of ringgit done within overnight or within a day. I think these are things that need to be addressed. When we talk about this administration essentially has been an administration in waiting for 20 years. And essentially what it promised was this kind of soft revolution in basically bringing about a whole new way of thinking of how we interact completely as a society. That's a great task. It can also raise a great deal of expectation, and perhaps one of the criticisms towards the present administration is that it's not fulfilling its promise.
Right.
But then the promise is so big, you see.
Right.
So in the cases of corruption...
Those two cases are quite different, right? One
They-
is
they-
like
yeah, they're
civil
very-
service and one is
Of
more
course.
private. But
Of course, they're very, very different, but they come from the same kind of wellspring. The banking industry, this kind of financial scamming and everything has a lot to do with how we actually operate these days. Everything is done digitally. These things can be so easily hacked and manipulated, and that is being done on a very, very regular basis.
Yeah.
I think in the entire struggle, it's very important to be seen to be broad and to be democratic in your approach. I think one of the criticisms that some of the public have is this element of favoritism. Right? So we really need a more a broad approach.
But do you think that because Anwar's administration came in on the promise of stamping out corruption, that they are now being held to a higher standard than others?
They are, but one of my also curious things is some of the investigations don't seem to have an end. So, for example, members from the previous administration, there's not enough evidence, and I don't know how that is then put together. Like Tan Sri Muhyiddin has been, absolved, basically, if I'm not mistaken. So how did that investigation take place in the first place? What was the evidence that was put together? We've seen several cases in court over the couple of years that are not reflective of an independent approach. Tan Sri Shari Samad was another, not enough evidence, and you still charge him. I mean, these are things I think that need to be brought into
So I
greater
suppose this
scrutiny.
sort of like hacks away and erodes the public's confidence within the
Very much
integrity
so.
of
I
the
think there's a great
institution.
danger for that, to be hasty in your fight against corruption. Again, I will emphasize that a very foundational approach has to be taken rather than going after individuals alone.
Understood.
Do you see the public's dissatisfaction towards what has transpired? I mean, this whole I won't say smoke screen, but it looks like it. A smoke screen sort of approach in terms of combating corruption. As you mentioned, you've got all these charges being brought to you, and then the cases get absolved. And then that trickled on in the state elections. I mean, status quo remain, but maybe Naj, you can highlight on this more in terms of our, especially in areas such as Terengganu, in which the Pakatan Harapan government was super confident to get basically East Coast and even Kedah, that we saw a lot of these Jelajah Madani campaigns being done, but in the results at the end of the day, it didn't met the expectations. So you see whatever the aspirations the government has put out and what the public actually want, the voters actually want, is completely disconnected.
Yeah, I think with regards to politics, it is normal to bang the war drums just before elections, no? To inspire confidence and motivate your troops. And especially in the face of the green wave, the much wanted green wave, and how it was supposed to be all-consuming with regards to East Coast states. We've seen evidence of that in Terengganu, I suppose. And but Edin, I want to check with you, macam Kelantan kan, a lot has been said by Anwar with regards to Kelantan's development. Do you think this will have an impact in the long term with regards to, how the voters think, how the voters will react?
The entire approach to the East Coast and to many of the past-led states at the moment has to be rooted in stamina. It's very difficult for you to arrive there, make lots of promises, and even deliver some of those promises without having a sustained effort at winning over the state. I'm one of those who's very cynical about this concept of the green wave. Okay, I think we are actually going through a very, very interesting period at the moment. It's not been written about, it's not being explored very, very much. But we are going through a period of democratic transition. And the democratic transition is happening most vibrantly among the Malays. And I think that needs to be studied. I don't think Perikatan Nasional, who are falling back increasingly on culture wars and identity politics, should take that too much for granted. They also have to deliver. And if they are not able to, particularly the state of Kelantan, then the state is up for taking. My problem with Pakatan Harapan is that their strategy is all wrong. So they have, as much as they beat the war drums before the state election, I don't see any kind of sustained effort at cultivating leadership at the grassroots level in the East Coast. It's as if we have just surrendered the states and then we'll wait for it to implode and then pick it up. Right. It's not going to happen that way. So I think PH have to have a far more their candidates, for example, in the last, forget the state elections, but in the last national elections, you're putting up guys who have lost there 4 times and still insisting that they should stand. How is this going to win over people? And more importantly, the people of the East Coast, I mean, I work so much in Kelantan, that's part of my territory, really. Subliminal aspects of cultural pride, regional identity, these things are very important. So, if they are felt that they are marginalized or treated like orphans, then they will stick by what they know. They have no other reason to vote for somebody they don't know.
I suppose, you can also see that in the recent, the current floods that are hitting the East Coast states. I think when the floods first hit and everything was going topsy-turvy, the first thing the Kelantan MB said was to blame it on the failure of the flood mitigation plans enacted by the federal government, right?
Yeah, we are so trapped in this you say this, I say this kind of culture. There are very serious and infrastructural issues that need to be looked at. But once again, I talk about our public officials and competence, you see. We are so rooted in this culture of blame game, when actually there are very practicable solutions that because we are trying to score political brownie points, we don't want to address these things, you know. So it really has become kind of blame game that everybody seems to be so ensnared in. This has got to stop because it's not bringing any kind of, and this is where public frustration lies. All right, people are not just interested in one or two cases of people being charged for corruption. People are interested in how you're going to approach the culture of corruption that has taken root here for the past at least 3 decades. That's what people are interested in. And your dialogue and your conversation and your political engagement has to be rooted in this as much as it has to be rooted in charging particular individuals, you know, in sometimes cases that don't seem to go anywhere.
Right.
Charging particular individuals. I mean, in the past year, we saw at least one former prime minister, which is Muhyiddin Yassin, being charged and arrested and then charged in March earlier this year, and then it's followed by Kedah caretaker Menteri Besar Sanusi. So both charges are quite separate. One is for the misappropriation of funds for Muhyiddin itself in his past administration. Sanusi is more of like his defiance against our Agong, right? And then also surrounding that case, it was right after the rare earth REE case right before the state elections. Because you mentioned something about brownie points that a lot of all these political figures are trying to gain from the voters. You still see it today, you know, with all this he said, she said narrative. How can we move away from that? I mean, what sort of implication might this bring if we continue, utilizing this sort of approaches?
I actually think the approaches don't work. I think, you know, we have a great disconnect now between Malaysian public, mature democratic voting public, and politicians who are unable to deal with the challenges of the opposition. For example, you talk of green wave. One of the reasons I don't really buy into this green wave overwhelming, and there's the silly language that is being used, Talibanization, and what is all this? It's we have a very particular experience, and the East Coast can be explained in just the way I've kind of explained. If you want to put a stop to this, then please provide alternatives. Right. We are not a rabid fundamentalist, though there are dangers of us falling into that by default, actually, through just this play. But we have to go. Political leadership is very weak at the moment at all levels. Political discourse is, the media needs to take a far more, I think, also proactive role. And so much discourse is right now defined and outlined, allowed by political operatives working on TikTok and things like that, which doesn't actually translate in votes, if you ask me. I think the role of social media is kind of exaggerated. Right. We have to look at a little more deep. Why did people vote for PN, for example? Because they're so fed up of BN for so long. Right. So I think we have to pay a lot of attention to subliminal things. Like, what is the negative vote? The protest vote. What does it actually mean? How is it actually operating? These are the territories we need to go in, rather than constantly have this melodramatic responses to things about Talibanization and issues like that.
Right. I mean, talking about PN's vote being split and going to PN. Okay, looking at Amno's Politics in particular, have you seen trends, shifting in political ideologies or alliances?
What is actually motivating the way it votes? I don't see the Malays as being rabid, unquestioning supporters of Perikatan Nasional. It's just that that's the choice they have.
Right.
I think PH has a great challenge in terms of further harnessing what this unity government is, because it's actually not a unity government, it is a coalition of various parties. So are they willing to take very fundamental steps in saying that this is a coalition, a new kind of coalition that you can trust, that you can depend on, that you can vote for, not just in this present arrangement, but in the next election, because that will provide the stability. And another very, very crucial thing, I think, that our political leadership has to pay very, very great attention to is what is Malaysia's place in the region and the rest of the world. We cannot delude ourselves with that. It's very real. There are indexes, there are competitive index, ASEAN competitive index.
So with that, right, what's your view towards Malaysia's approach in talking about cultural integration? You know, we live in a plural society, and then having that and, you know, amplifying it on the broader spectrum, international spectrum, I'm saying. Because we seem to still be stuck in, you know, statements that focus on cultural division. So how can we move beyond that?
These questions that are getting more and more parochial and insular are bewildering to me, because we are, in essence, not just a nation, but a region that is really, you know, plural and multicultural and always has been. As politics becomes more and more desperate, because, you know, look at just 20 years ago, you know, you had things like kind of firm political loyalties.
Right.
You had a firm political base. None of that operates these days for any of the political parties, including PAS. You know, PAS do not, they may have core supporters, you know, maybe 1 million of them, and the rest are not. They are very, you know, on shifting sands. They've suddenly come to discover also that their vote means a great deal. Right? But there are some issues that need to be really dealt with, like political conditioning of the young. You know, how does that happen? How does social media influence the young voter? The last elections was very instructive. You know, when we brought down the voting age.
Yes.
I wasn't actually very supportive of it. Not because I don't think 18-year-olds should vote, but voting should be done with political literacy. And there's no political education for our young anywhere. So they get it off TikTok, and they're so, you know, kind of boosted by their adrenaline and their...
So they're susceptible to manipulation.
Very susceptible, sorry. I suppose so. You know, it's a big political question. And I think we are not going through this period of transition since 2018 in very mature ways.
But I suppose maybe you can draw some positives from the fact that a lot of the younger generation are now generally more interested in the political happenings, right?
Yes, but in what way? You know, and what knowledge do they bring? If you bring prejudice and then are activated, that's not a very good thing for us. You know, the world's problems today are essentially how do people live together, issues of things like, you know, migration, people's movements. These are not just migration, but people's movements. How do states protect their boundaries, and you know, how do we deal with all the subliminals? Because if you look at the world today, no one's talking so much about economic crisis, and a lot of attention should be paid to those kinds of things because they exist, but about free flow of movement of people, you know, who is taking over our country, who is hijacking our identities. We look to a possible return of President Trump in the United States. So we are dealing with this, subliminal issues. And Malaysia, being what it is in terms of its cultural makeup, of its, should be more instructive about how we can live as pluralist societies or multiple societies, but rather we are imitating the culture wars of other countries.
Right.
My last question for this segment is, at least under the Madani administration, right? What sort of the Madani element that is still not translating across to the public yet?
Yeah, you know, please don't get me wrong, I'm not despairing at all. I'm actually very excited about this time we live in. But I think we all need to play our part in trying to rationalize and make sense and create openings for the possibilities that we have actually voted for, right? So Madani is a very interesting concept. I'm very supportive of it. It's also been a concept that the Prime Minister has mendukung, has carried for decades. It's not a new thing. And I love it because I love the concept of the Madani, which is a marketplace where people come together. They exchange not just goods and money, but ideas and experiences. And if you look at many of the great Madinas around the world, you will find that it's a place where it's very chaotic, it's very wild, it's bustling all the time, vibrant. So I'm very supportive of it, but then you have to maintain the spirit of it, It cannot be engineered, and it cannot be managed all the time. So you must allow for Medina,
To organically.
to be organic, and it must have a life and spirit of its own.
Right.
It cannot be managed all the time. So as far we have seen the Prime Minister go, he's got incredible energy, I must say. Sometimes I get tired just seeing walking around the place, visiting one place and another. But he can't be the sole person, selling this. Everybody, first of all, has to understand what it is, and lots of people don't actually understand what it is, so they become cynical. And the last thing I would say about Madania, because I think it reflects Kerajaan Madani, I think it reflects some of the challenges of this administration, is people are so fed up of this kind of rhetorical, keyword phrases.
Right.
So you have to give it a kind of life that other things like, One Malaysia and all those things came before that didn't have. And I think it has to be invested with an element of freedom and liberty for people to decide how they want to operate within this kind of concept.
Let's go into all the top news that broke in business that also overlap with policy changes. But I want to start this segment off with our Prime Minister declaring a halt to new skyscraper construction. Now, Asila, maybe you can elaborate on the rationale behind this. How would it impact, or how has it impacted investor confidence?
Right. So PM stated this in the beginning of the year, basically saying that the whole point of not having more skyscrapers also because he doesn't want to compete with his predecessors. And we already have a lot like KLCC, KL Tower, and he wants to focus more on small businesses, which I think is it's a good approach that he should take, because economists have asked him to focus more on the domestic market instead of just focusing external, because we have other issues that he could tackle in the country. So by not having skyscrapers, I don't think it would even affect investors' confidence too much, because we already have other skyscrapers that we could bank on. Like recently the TRX, they already have a lot of flagship stores there that could also attract investments. Yeah, so PM could also focus on MSMEs because they contribute about 38% in our GDP. But for having more of these stalls and he said more parks and nature, I think that could also attract even more tourists to come in, because I don't think they would want to come to Malaysia just to focus on the modern landmarks. I think we have other historical sites that we could refurbish, maybe in Malacca and all sorts like Penang.
And I suppose in a post-COVID-19 pandemic environment also is important to focus on the micros and how about developing the Malaysian micro economy as a whole, right? MSMEs.
Like focusing more on our culture, I guess. Well, if we have more of MSMEs and SMEs highlighting our own products, that could entice more foreigners to come in.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. With that, right, how do we ensure there's no gentrification happening? I mean, sometimes when we want to push for our cultural identity to be, put on a national, push it on a national scale, there's a risk of it being turned into a business or being turned for profit, right? Edin, you also have experience with Pusaka, dealing with communities the grassroots communities who are pushing for their own cultural identities to be acknowledged among not just the local community but beyond. What's the, I suppose, approach in terms of how we can actually push for cultural identity without selling it off?
Azila, thank you, because and one of the wonderful ways this conversation has gone is to talk about economy, and that one thing that we think has nothing to do with the economy, which is culture. This is perhaps our greatest error, that we do not understand and facilitate our cultural resources to empower the economy. The Prime Minister's statement on skyscrapers was very, very important, because it really identified a significant shift towards what has been the culture of enterprise in this,
right. Or the idea of modernization.
Or the idea of modernization, which has been very, very kind of let's get first world, with hard economy and hard development. We have got 3 major skyscrapers in the country today. In Kuala Lumpur city alone, we are just within a radius of each other. KLCC, we have TRX, and then of course we have Merdeka 118. So there is a sense that Kuala Lumpur may be out, bursting at the seams with this, and then how is that going to be sustained? I think there's a concern that everything's just going to be recycled. You move here for now, and then we move there after a while.
Right.
While not actually drawing real investment in. Although from foreign international trade organizations and so on, Malaysia is still very much a primed destination for all kinds of reasons: quality of life, use of English, very, very basic things. But the Prime Minister's statement about skyscrapers has to be taken very seriously. And kind of deconstructed, because what it does point to is a whole different kind of economic transformation for the country. Malaysia is totally devoid of an alternative soft economy plan. We don't have one. We're still talking very much about FDIs and heavy industry, heavy building. So much can be done with culture in terms of everything from products to commodities to e-economy, digital stuff. Using it can also very much empower local communities if you know how to integrate an economy with tourism, with craft, with production, and so on. And lots of people don't need to earn 10,000 ringgit or 15,000 ringgit a month. They are perfectly happy with 3,500. They stay in the places that they do. They develop skills and crafts that can be imported and exported everywhere. This is something called the cultural economy. It is one of the most dominant areas that is opening up in Southeast Asia. Indonesia, for example, has made it one of its principal economic pillars for 2050. We have just the most obsolete and anachronistic and unexplored cultural economy profiles and plans in the entire region and perhaps in the world. So backward, we've created agencies that don't seem to actually understand what the cultural economy is and what it's supposed to do, and how to make profit of it. There are things about Kuala Lumpur, for example. Kuala Lumpur is a depressed city. It should actually be about 10 times more vibrant than it is. But it too is being haunted by cultural politics of all kinds. Cannot do this, cannot do that, cannot Coldplay, cannot, And really the people who are belaboring us with all of this stuff, I think are quite irrelevant and marginal. I don't know why we're giving them so much attention. Issues like Kampong Baru, I don't see what the problem is. Go in there and have a very reasonable and rational plan about how you can create urban regeneration, right? Rather than just really slap Kuala Lumpur with towers here and there.
Urban regeneration versus urban development.
That's there you go.
Right.
There is a meeting point. There is a meeting point. You just need to look at Singapore to see how they have done it. So I think, but this goes back into a whole free fall of all kinds of other things. I don't actually understand how developers work here. They seem to reign, unfettered in this country, and they can seem to step anywhere and just take things over? What is that rationalization? And Kuala Lumpur is very important in basically determining the economic future of this country because it's the capital city. So I think Kuala Lumpur should be made a model about how we rethink development and economic progress. And then the other model should be more, more rural areas perhaps. The word rural is also for me not... I think Sarawak's doing a good job in kind of engineering things that way. Sarawak has all kinds of other problems, so let's not be very romantic. The questions of inequality, distribution of wealth all need to be, and structures need to be set up. But I think in terms of the future of multiracial politics, about the kinds of developments that can happen, sustainability, environment, all these kinds of things, they are making all the right statements, which we will then have to see whether it bears fruit in the next decade or so.
Since we're still on the topic of development and everything, I just want to bring your attention to Forest City. We have an update whereby the developer itself, which is CGPV, defended the project against accusation of it being, a failed project. Like, Edin, how does this defense impact perceptions of foreign investment, particularly those involving Chinese companies? I mean, we're talking about, we want a more, introspective development engagements, but when we look at Forest City, how do we navigate future engagements?
Forest City is really a reflection of how Malaysia's place in the world has kind of slid down. We'll have freak stories like Ghost City that just came out on the BBC. I think there was about a 3 to 5 minute clip on Forest City as a ghost city. And that's Malaysia's presence in the world today. We need to address that, and we need to address it seriously by talking about other things like how communities and societies can live together. But I think Forest City is a very good reflection on, again, developers and their relationship with state administrations. It's also very reflective, of course, of our relationship with China. And you see, we are still an exporting country. We are still basically a country that reaches out to the rest of the world. Very important FDIs, things like that. And our political rhetoric and our economic rhetoric is getting so insular and parochial that we don't acknowledge this. Right. So one of the reasons to talk about why our economy is suffering, of course, is to talk about China and what China is really going through at the moment. A very serious transition, political transition, economic transition, all the great Chinese success stories. Jack Ma, for example, where is he now? And you think that doesn't have an effect? That doesn't effect on China's economic planning. A lot of people are talking about an economic crisis in China. There is hint of that. But I think more importantly is a very fundamental thing that is happening. What is the CCP, the government of China, trying to rationalize with the economy? How much does it want to intervene? How much does it want to take control of? Right. Has it started to realize that all these very successful Chinese businessmen have turned out to be monsters they themselves have created? Right. So as a result, there's a rationalization process that's going on in China that has tremendous effect on us. And we don't make that link, you see. I think Forest City is just one of those examples of essentially how we were so captivated and maybe a bit mabok, with the whole Chinese drive.
But the Prime Minister has mentioned that the Look East policy now will also include China, right? So I suppose it will be interesting to see as to what lessons we draw from what the Chinese government is undergoing now, not just in terms of economically, but also politically, how it addresses, like you said, the monsters that they created so far. Korea probably, I think the Prime Minister mentioned that Korea is also one of the Look East policy, one of the new Look East policy countries that we are looking at as well, right? What sort of lessons can we draw from South Korea, perhaps, with regards to what we can implement in Malaysia as well?
Yeah, South Korea is interesting, of course, because their political evolution has been so bloody, for one.
Volatile,
Volatile. But their democratic maturity has been great. And, you know, a lot of their democratic maturity, Kim Dae-jung, for example, was, you know, former political prisoner who then came on and started this kind of liberalization of the Korean experience. Look at where they are with culture and things like that. They've got all kinds of other problems, social problems. We just saw the death of the actor from Parasite. You have that kind of psychotic aspect to the society that is so defined by social media. We can learn from that also. But, you know, in terms of laying certain kinds of foundations, I think there's a lot to be gleaned. But let me just also add, Malaysia has been very, very, especially through the Mahathir years, not that I'm just praising him a lot, but I think we need to have a sense of continuity in how we look at things. Look-East policy is one thing, but I don't see why we are not at the same time resurrecting our South-South initiative. You know, countries of Africa, Latin America, South America, you know, countries of the Asia Pacific. Where has that gone? Malaysia was a leader in that. And as we look at, you know, political power play and the innovation of great powers, including China, now very preoccupied with its economic future.
Yes.
The United States is still the leading power, but it's a declining power. You know, it can't even seem to have any sway over the way Israel acts in Gaza. You know, it's so strange, that relationship. It's you know, it seems like the United States, this huge power, is almost pleads with Israel to be just sensible. In all of this, where is Malaysia positioning itself? You know, we had an advantage at one time. African economies are starting to really rise.
Right.
We have Lula in Brazil. What is our reach out to them? What about countries in like Saudi Arabia, for example, you know, who are revolutionizing? So I think we need to go back and really map out and chart out. But we need brain, and I'm afraid that, you know, everybody, analysts can come and talk about all kinds of things, but as long as we are beginning to suffer and innovating on our conceptual understanding of where Malaysia should be and where Malaysia can be, then we are in serious trouble.
This is, of course, annually we will always get this, but like our AG report recently disclosing Malaysia's financial liabilities being at, you know, 1.39 trillion. Now, Asila, maybe you can share more on this. Like, how does this situation compare to other countries in the region, and you know, what lessons can be drawn from their experiences in which we can adopt?
So in the report, it states it's 1.39 trillion, but it also stated that we shouldn't be too concerned, because as long as our revenue and GDP increases, then we would be able to mitigate the liabilities lah. Because although our federal liabilities increase, its ratio to GDP is lower compared to last year, and then our total debt was also lower compared to last year. So in comparison with other countries, like Japan's debt to their GDP ratio is about 260%, and then Singapore is also high at about 160. So it goes back to, if we can service the debt, then it really shouldn't be something that trigger too much concerns. Because our ceiling is at 65%, right? And they estimate that this year it will be 63%. The only thing that the number that they should be worried about, according to economists lah, that they said, is to look at the budget deficit to GDP. Because if it's above 4%, then we might not be able to cut our debt below the ceiling limit of 65%. So to bring that down, our budget deficit has to be below 4%, which most economists are still not sure when that could happen. But I think, to go back to the liabilities, as what has been stated in the report, it shouldn't be too much of a concern because GDP and revenue is still increasing because our tax base is also widening.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean,
Right.
now I'm just curious of what kind of safeguarding elements are in place to ensure that we, not worry. Simply put.
Right. One of it is, of course, taxes, because in budget they said that taxes will increase. That should add in on the increase of service tax to 8% would give us about 900 million ringgit more in our revenue, right? Yeah.
We need to bring back the GST. Come on, man. Let's be real. The debt thing is very interesting because there's a psychological factor that bedevils Malaysia when it comes to things like debt. I hate debt. I'm never going to advocate debt, but one of the realities is that all nations live on debt. Look at the United States. I mean, like totally crazy, right? In Times Square, you just see that thing ticking up. But we are bedeviled by the fact that our Prime Minister for 22 years was obsessed with debt. So he always tried to moderate debt. And of course, one of his great claims on leaving office was that Malaysia's debt was very low when he left. That's a good thing. But debt is also very fluid, and it's very improvisatory. So I think we are once again having to really rethink and reformulate just about everything. Reformulation of tax policies, for example. And of course, we have to grapple with that very, very awful and very worrying thing about cut in subsidies. People are conditioned to believe subsidies are their right.
Yes.
Now, how do you begin to disassemble that and dismantle that without having a complete economic rationalization for everybody? And I think it begins with tax.
I suppose the dilemma for the administration is that you've been championing a platform on reducing the cost of living, and yet at the same time, when it comes to rationalization or removing of subsidies, that's just going to raise cost of living for many other people, right?
Yes.
So how do you reconcile that with what you're trying to sell? Right? Yeah. And do you think it will have an impact in the long term with regards to political decisions? Or
I think it already has. I think it already has. That's a very good point. Standard of living is still generally quite manageable in Malaysia because we are resource rich. So we can actually, if we focus, produce a lot of the stuff that we need to produce for consumption over here, especially very basic consumption. But we're not managing that. You see, we're not thinking about it very much. Everything from food security issues and all that. We're just uttering them. Have you noticed that we seem to identify all of our problems and then don't seem to do very much about it after that? So that's I think something we need to grapple with. I think there's a broad consensus. Standard of living is still quite manageable in Malaysia, and even if subsidies start to peter away, if we complement that with real efforts at production. My great concern with all of this stuff, of course, is even with things like debt and taxes and so on, is you have to be competitive. And we are really losing out on our competitive edge. And so we can't complement the changes that we need to make with real production.
Right. I mean, since we're talking about debt, I also want to highlight that there are amendments made to the Insolvency Act in which the amendments saw a second chance to bankrupt individuals. But the key question here is that how can the government move away from allowing our nation to rely on social welfare, government resources, basically creating a better sustainable plan in terms of debt management.
Again, let's go back and rationalize our economic thinking. We regard social welfare as charity. So a large part of our psychology is that of having created a charity mentality. We're not actually thinking of social inequalities and how to address them, how to restructure society. We're not. That's what the new economic policy was meant to do. not just feed people in need, talk about the poor. I mean, we're not the Salvation Army, we need to have far more credible and forceful thinking about issues like this, which the new economic policy was supposed to do. And then somewhere along the way, it didn't do that. It created instead this subsidy mentality, created this charity mentality. We need to attitudinally look more and more at our society in terms of investments. How do you invest particular communities to raise themselves up? What else needs to go with that? What kind of educative process? What kind of, financial literacy, for example, is totally absent in our education system.
Right.
But if you go now, but people are very keyed into it. If you go on Instagram, if you go and find, these young Malay women these days who are experts on financial literacy and the large
Correct.
followings they have.
Correct.
What is going to be very interesting, I think, is how the government and the administration is able to cope with all these very interesting and ingenious independent things that are coming up. Talking to people about how they look after their money, how they make their savings, what they invest in, and all these kinds of things.
The challenge also, I suppose, is political stability and continuity, because when you enact a policy and just chops and changes every time a new government comes in, it's very hard to implement, right?
Especially when those chops and changes are based on a lot of personal animosity. I think that's something we need to be very honest about in our politics at the moment. That a lot of it is really haunted by personality politics and personal animosity. That cannot augur well at all for the development of a collective nation.
Right. I want to move along to our next segment in terms of the social impact the Madani government has brought us the past year. But before that, maybe Asila, you can, because we talked about our debt, national debt, and then in terms of how we can move away in terms of the dependency towards public resource and subsidies, basically. In terms of the end of subsidies for high electricity users, what has your stakeholders, or at least in the business side, expressed to you?
They said it wouldn't affect them too much because basically these are who would be affected is mostly households that use this much of electricity. I think 600 kilowatt power to 1,500, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So they said with this to businesses there would not be much effect. Even to inflation, there would be not much effect on this. Cuma for households, the issue concerning that matter was how would the government identify the financial status of these households, meaning low to mid income families would still might need to use high electricity if they have large family members in a household.
But I think from a consumer perspective, what surprised me most was the pushback from consumers themselves, because when that was announced, I think the general tone was that, and the emphasis was that 88% of electricity consumers will not be affected.
Yes.
And yet that remaining 12%, there was so much like, whoa.
Yeah.
So I think that offers a little bit of a taster with regards to how targeted subsidies will be received, maybe. Although a smaller percentage is affected, and yet the outcry is so huge. Right? So I would like to see what the reaction will be when eventually targeted fuel subsidies come in, and other similar stuff. And PADU is supposed to resolve that with regards to identifying family income, median income on the end. But do you think that this could be a precursor as to what the situation will be?
It all depends on how things are explained and how a society is prepared for the changes that are going to happen. I believe there's an agency called JCOM.
Yes.
What does it do? It's all part of an educative process. Singapore is very interesting. When Singapore goes through a recession, the Prime Minister has a national address, and then the information agencies essentially start to explain what is actually going to happen, what people need to do, and how they need to respond to things like a recession. Over here, we do not have that kind of sustained effort essentially at engaging our communities, you see. Different communities sometimes require different kinds of information. And you must be prepared to do that, yeah. We have had a serious crisis, and this is the result maybe of, having Amno reign in that kind of heavy way for close to, never mind 60 years, but about 40 years. We are finding it very hard to come up with forms of consultative government, even in this period of great democratic transition. Successive administrations do not know how to be consultative. They don't know how to draw on expertise. They don't know how to, we have arrived at a point where even cabinet positions, for example, have to be thought of more radically, rather than just rewarding our political parties for their support. You have to seriously think of expertise. So I was quite encouraged, for example, that the Deputy Finance Minister too, was not a politician,
Right.
but somebody who has had vast experience, essentially, in managing the economy, which is what is needed. Yeah. And then I was very encouraged that Datuk Jogani went to commodities. We are a commodity nation, so his kind of thinking and experience would lend a great deal to that area. But when we think of the great change that needs to take place, we better think about how we are going to engage the public. And it starts off, of course, with subsidies in electricity and then fuel subsidies. Eventually, it's going to move into other things.
Yeah.
And to be really honest, I don't see how the goods and services tax can be delayed for very much longer. It is a progressive tax. And any progressive society in the midst of great change needs something like that.
Do you think that the reluctance to re-implement the GST is due to political factors, perhaps?
It's hantu, brother. That's what it is. And we have, at the end of, political wrap-up 2023, I think we have to be very honest that a lot of things that don't allow us to do the necessary things are subliminal. They are specters, and we are bertinju dengan bayang-bayang, shadow boxing all the time, So it really is time to take stock and get very serious. And, in this process of political maturity, you may realize that taking bold steps, explaining them better, increasing your delivery service will be the thing that ensures that you are voted in the next round.
Right.
I think one main topic that we want to highlight across is the implementation of DLP, the dual language program for Standard 1 pupils, right? We saw a lot of debates concerning DLP. Much of it comes from, the parent-teacher or at least parents themselves. Edin, I understand that you were formerly a UEC chairman, a task force lead. Maybe you have a say in this. Like, how can we foster better educational goals for our students, for our future generations?
By going back to fundamentals. My experience in the Education Reform Committee, I was chairman of the UEC, United Examination Service Task Force, which has been one of the most contentious things and really gets to the heart, essentially, if you ask me, about what education reform means in this country. Very, very crucial thing if we are to make any kind of strides and progress. Education has to be fixed. Yeah,
of course.
Education is totally underfunded, completely underfunded, and lots of more resources. Although it gets the bigger share of the budget, a lot of it goes into the bureaucracy actually, not into actually empowering our centers of learning. The DLP controversy, it goes to the heart of what people really want. This has nothing to do with the public. I think the public are very open to this kind of thing. I was a product of the dual language program.
Right.
I was a child of the 1970s when we shifted attention after me. I'm a child of 69, born in 1969. So the 70s, we are the experimental generation, and I think a lot of us came out very, 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 very well. These days, people think of education completely in functional terms. We have confused knowledge with information. We think they are one and the same things. They are not. We don't have real pedagogy in our schools. We don't actually know why we are teaching our children, apart from the fact that they are going to get jobs later on. And this is the one thing that crosses all kind of education systems, private, public, national, vernacular, whatever. And nobody understands even why they are studying. I'm sorry to have to drag you back to this kind of big philosophical things, but I think it's very crucial. So when we have all this carping that goes on about things like dual language program, about vernacular schools and so on, I don't think it's a thing that bothers the greater public. But nobody's engaging the greater public, you see. I think most of the greater public completely agree that living in a society like Malaysia, all of our children should be naturally trilingual. There is really, so it's not even just a dual language thing. I think we should be moving into third language and learning another foreign language or so on. I think Malay our national language is in serious crisis. I'm flawless in my Malay. In fact, I think maybe I speak it better than English. But there's nothing done to invest the Malay language with a sense of universality, with a sense of reaching out, with a sense of engagement. We have now fallen in terms of the national language to falling back on the law, wanting to fine people for not speaking Malay. I mean, this is really quite ridiculous. So again, I'm sorry to say that we have to go back to asking very fundamental questions about our education, approach to education. Forget policies, forget textbooks and all that, but a real rethinking about what kind of children we want to produce in the future. Another thing that I'm also very, very concerned about is how we are completely uncritical when it comes to learning through technology. We're completely uncritical.
You mean why? We are at the expense of technology?
No, I'm saying that we just embrace it as a good thing.
I see.
Meanwhile, our children are losing very, very fundamental resources in their senses and everything. They don't know how to interact with other human beings, for example.
Okay.
I'm not saying we can actually insulate ourselves from technological developments, but we must be critical. I mean, if I come up with examples, for example, of institutions of higher learning here, and how people are plagiarizing. Plagiarism is such a major problem.
Right.
Claiming authorship over things you've not written is such a major problem. Using ChatGPT to come up with all your, there must be a solution, must be a discussion on all these things. So we cannot even agree on dual language in a nation that should be naturally trilingual. People are carping about this. So sometimes I think we're just like being distracted constantly. And every individual group is there for its own purpose alone. And these groups don't actually reflect, the broader public. I'll give you one example. In Kelantan, you would think that Kelantan is very, hardcore in terms of its approach to national language and all. Of course it is, very proud, not just of the Malay language, but of the Kelantan dialect, which I happen to speak very well. But Kelantanese kids race to go to Chinese school because they want to master science and mathematics, and they want to be competitive in business. You would not get this if you listen to Malay language rights groups. You would not have no sense of this. So I think we need to get more real about what our society actually wants. And you know what our society actually wants? They want to be more worldly. They want to be more liberated. They want to have more easy and imaginative access to things like markets, to other societies, to other cultures for their products and so on. They are not going into rabbit holes and hiding and protecting their turf. So again, I think in 2023, as we round up, what do I look for in 2024? Greater openness, greater consultation, and the ability, I think, to see through our democratic transition by opening up space and speaking to broader constituencies of people.
Your wish and hopes for 2024 as we end 2023, going into 2024. I mean, you're at a position whereby you see all this, news breaks and everything. So you kind of expect sometimes what's coming, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, from a journalistic perspective, I suppose. What interestingly, I'm going to echo pretty much what Edin says here: more openness, more transparency, and a lot more foresight, I suppose, with what we plan to do. Right. The key thing for me this year, in 2024, will be to see how effective some of the policies that have been touted are going to be carried out and implemented. Because as Edin said, we can talk about policies, can talk about the problems, but the solutions will eventually need to be addressed, right? And 2024 could be a year of solutions. I'm naturally optimistic, so counterfoil lah.
What about you, Asila? I hope for the best for everything, honestly, because I'm a business writer. So what we see, there's always talks about Malaysia being resilient, but then we don't know how resilient we are in all of these issues that are coming up. So I hope on the business side, we get to see more actions and initiatives being done.
Yeah. Well, we do have, a couple more days or a few more days until the end of the year, right? Until then, as journalists ourselves, we never sleep. We will still be waiting for what the next, day will bring us. But of course, just to reiterate all my, my panel members here, openness, transparency, and a better idea of what resilience is. I think this is not just a reflection of what we want, but a reflection of what the society at large want. So to our audience back at home, if you've been tuning in to us or been following our news reports on NSD, please still do, because we have a lot in store for 2024. My name is Amalina Kamal. I just want to say thanks to my guests here today, Asila from the Business Desk, Edin Khoo from ISIS Malaysia, as well as Naj from the NSD Desk. Again, if you like our episode, subscribe, suggest topic of interest. We'll see you next year. Bye, everybody.